All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Steve Haase. I'm the moderator for this panel on climate justice. So we're happy to have you here. We're happy to have our panelists, and Dr. Jantz will be here shortly. So we have three panelists: Dr. Claire Jantz, Geography, Earth Science; Dr. Misty Knight, Human Communication Studies on the far left; and also Director of Women's Studies. That'll be important because part of her talk will relate to that. And Dr. Tim Maret from biology. I'm in the psychology department, so you can see we have a diverse number of faculty working on some of these issues. So without further ado, we'll get started and have Dr. Maret lead us off with part of his presentation.
You're not doing
This,
either. You were starting with the
well,
sustainability goal.
yeah, well, I thought maybe, do you
Sure,
want to come
I
up
can
here
do it.
and
Yeah, I can do it.
run it up? Yeah, okay.
All right. So I have three things I'd like to accomplish in my short time up here. One is to make you a little less scared of climate change. The second, this sounds bad, but it's to make you feel a little more guilty. And third, to maybe actually feel like doing something about it. So I talk to a lot of students who are really worried that climate change is the end of the world. And, I want to convince you it's not first by showing you a graph. This is a graph running from 1950 to 2100. Showing predictions for what our temperatures are going to do based on how we respond in terms of our technology and in terms of our move to sustainable uses of energy and other sustainable ways of living. And you can see there's a whole gamut from not too bad all the way up to horrible. The good news is that the horrible is pretty much off the table now. That we've made such advances in wind energy and solar energy and so on that we're not headed there. The bad news is we've also let things go too long that we're not going to end up with the really good scenarios either. We're going to end up somewhere in the middle, probably somewhere along this yellow line here, which I do not want to convince you is good. It is bad, but it still leaves a livable world. It still leaves a world where you will live a comfortable life. It's a world in which we will have more natural disasters. We are going to lose species. People will suffer. But you will lead a decent life. And you can see that in this map here of climate vulnerability. You might not feel real lucky today, but you are. You won the lottery. You live in the right country. Okay, as you can see from this map here, the United States is in green. It's going to fare pretty well. The scary part is that when you look in the global south, you look in the developing world, they are going to get hit hard. I think that's where the real justice, the real moral issues come in. That people are going to suffer. If you think people are trying to cross our border in large numbers now, wait till the end of the century when things are really hot and miserable and see how many people are trying to enter our country then. So you're lucky. Your life will be okay. We'll have more storms, we'll have more droughts, we'll have more natural disasters, we will lose species, but it will still be a livable world, and it will still be a world where things like love and beauty still exist. Now I want to take you back in history to the roughly the last 75 years, because you're going to see something interesting on this graph as we go from 1750 to 2000. You see this sudden rise in everything starting around the end of World War II, what's often called the Great Acceleration. This led to huge changes in our lives. Somebody born in 1945, 1950 is living in a very different world today than they lived in back then. Prior to World War II, less than half of Americans had refrigerators, less than a third of Americans had telephones. And so we've seen this huge change in our lifestyles. This has come as a result of a huge increase in the use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, and so on, which has been a two-edged sword. It's provided a lot of good, but it's also provided a lot of environmental damage, ecological damage, damage to people. It's also important to note that the benefits have gone to a minority of the world's population. As you can see from this statistic, 58% of the global population today is virtually living on the edge. And I think we forget that too often, that the benefits have really have gone to the few at the cost of the many. We see tremendous damage from air pollution, primarily hitting impoverished people, people who are forced to live in areas near that, people who lived in those areas when those plants were built there because they knew they could get away with building them there. That's environmental justice right there, or injustice right there. Indigenous peoples who've had their land scarred and destroyed in the search for fossil fuels, who've been exposed to oil spills and things like that. And when indigenous people have revolted against the destruction of their land, they've often met with violence. For example, this person on the left was just killed in February of this year for standing up to the oil companies in Ecuador. And so I think it's important for us to remember that there's been a huge cost to our use of fossil fuels. And that cost continues today in the form of climate change, where people in the developing world in particular are suffering from intense droughts. And people in island communities are struggling, trying to save their islands, which they will not be able to do. And when we look at who is going to weather this fairly well and who is going to suffer, we see a really sad trend here where the people who cause the damage are the ones who are going to be pretty well off. They are less vulnerable. That's all these countries in green. The countries that didn't cause the problem at all, the countries in red, they are the most vulnerable. That includes most of the continent of Africa, which is responsible for only 4% of global carbon emissions. So as you go from left to right, you go from less vulnerable to more vulnerable, and you tend to see the ones that are not vulnerable are the highly developed countries. The ones that are vulnerable are the ones that are not highly developed. The size of the circle is the size of their carbon footprint. So you see the United States has a huge carbon footprint. We're responsible for a lot of the environmental damage, yet we're going to suffer very few of the consequences of it. It is really important that we move as fast as we can to a low carbon future. That's going to mean lots of solar panels, lots of wind farms, lots of electric cars. But this is where I get really worried, because if we treat the next 70 years the way we treated the last 70 years, that suffering that goes on among the majority of the world's populations is not going to be alleviated. This is expensive technology. This is technology that we can afford, but a lot of the developing world can't. It's important that we share. We also have to realize that this technology is greener, but it's not green. Every technology has its costs. This is a facility for getting lithium for batteries. Lots of environmental destruction going on there. This particular picture here is happening on indigenous lands where the people don't want it to be there. Windmill blades need to be replaced. Solar panels need to be replaced. They pile up. There is a cost to all this. There's an environmental cost to all this. If we continue to want to just continue that acceleration and live bigger lives with bigger houses and bigger cars and more stuff, it's not going to end well, especially for those people who are presently already suffering from the costs of our fossil fuel economy. I show you this graph here because I think this fairly well describes our present economy. Work harder, earn more money, buy more things, keep going. It's a costful economy. It's caused tremendous amounts of environmental damage and damage to people. I would encourage you today to think about a different path. A path of lives that are measured in quality rather than quantity, with livable communities, walkable neighborhoods, a path with a close access to nature, a path where we honor people, we value people, not things, a path where we measure the quality of our life not by the size of a house we live in, but by how much time we spend with friends and family. I think it's time for us to think outside the box here. Less work, more time with family, less stuff, more time communing with nature. A future in which those indigenous people, those developing worlds, those impoverished communities are allowed to bring their standards of living up without us, the few and the lucky, depleting those resources, depleting the world. Again, it's not going to be the world we live in today. We're going to lose some species. There's going to be some suffering, but it can be a positive world. The faster we get there, the better. The more we value people around the world, the better. I would also encourage you not to forget our non-human inhabitants of the planet. I think we could extend climate justice to them. I want to leave you with 3 quotes. The ecological crisis is a crisis of character by Wendell Berry. We know better. If we continue on the path we are, that is a horrible moral tragedy. The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. It's up to us now. And let's rethink our goals and our values to leave the world a bit better. That is to have succeeded. We need to measure success by things other than how much we own. My biggest worry when I give a talk like this is this. You guys probably can't read it there because of the stuff in the way. It's not too late to combat climate change if we accept the reality and work together for the common good. And the 2 students in the audience were blanked. No, we have to think beyond that. We're not blanked. Let's envision a future that's not worse than the one we're in. Let's envision a future that's better than the one we're in. Like I say, more quality, less quantity. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Maret. Thank you, Dr. Maret. That was excellent. In fact, the other day, there was a report released that the British government commissioned that showed that if you look at things like gross domestic product, like in the US, you might find, okay, yeah, it's 4% a year. But he showed that, well, that doesn't take into the costs of the damage that growth causes to the environment. So the true GDP might, be something like 1%. So something else to consider along those lines. All right, let me see if I can do this without messing things up here with the technology. So I want to share another. Oops, I don't know if this is the right. Yeah, this is the right one. But first, I wanted to put this one up. Bear with me here. I hope we're still recording. Is everything going okay? I hope. Let me know if it's not, because I think I still kept that. So I wanted to kind of thank Dr. Maret as well for kind of weaving together the environmental and also some of the social costs of climate change. And in fact, the UN, if you look at this slide, shows their 17 sustainability goals, sustainable development goals. And you can see that a lot of them really do touch on sort of climate justice issues like no poverty, zero hunger, et cetera. So with that in mind, Dr. Jantz is going to present the next section. I can run the show, or if you want to come up here.
No, I'll just, yep.
Here.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And sorry, I kind of came in hot, but I just came from teaching class. And yeah, as Dr. Haase pointed out, these are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's interesting that the first goal is to end poverty. And that's really kind of connecting to what Dr. Maret talked about, these kind of ending poverty and feeding people. If we're able to accomplish those things, a lot of our other pieces will fall into place. When people aren't worried about where their next meal is going to come from, they're able to think more about, making different choices about energy use or lifestyle. And I'm glad to follow Dr. Maret because he set up some of the points that I want to make. And I wanted to focus on goal number 12, responsible consumption and production, which underlies our triple planetary crisis, which includes climate change, but also includes biodiversity loss. We are living in what is now called the sixth extinction because of the elevated rate of species loss and pollution. So that's kind of the triple threat that we're living in right now. And also, as Dr. Maret pointed out, in the developed world, in North America, in the United States, we are big contributors to these problems. And I wanted to focus on things that we can do as individuals to change our lifestyles, to change our culture a little bit, because that's one of the things that needs to change. I don't want to leave you with the idea that the only thing that needs to happen is individuals changing their actions, because a lot of things need to happen at the top. We need to change pieces that we need to make big changes in pieces of our economy. We need to make big changes in our energy infrastructure. Those are obviously things that we as individuals can't tackle, but we can support it and we can prepare ourselves for making those changes as they come online. We have some pretty big goals that we need to reach by 2030 in order to achieve some of the lower end changes related to climate change. We need to have our carbon emissions by 2030. We need to preserve half of our land by 2050 in order to avert some of these climate crises and biodiversity crises. So we have some really ambitious big things that we need to achieve. But I think it's also important for us as individuals, particularly in places like the United States, where we might have a lot of guilt and feel a lot of responsibility and anxiety about the climate crisis, to do things in our own lives that will help contribute to a more positive future. So I'm going to invite you to make small changes in how you eat and how we move. Food and transportation in particular are two pretty big pieces of our carbon story in the US. And if we look at how we eat, this is, if you've taken my intro to sustainability class, you would have seen this graphic before. This is showing food waste for different regions of the world, and not just food waste, but also the source of that food waste. So you can see in North America and Oceania, that includes Australia, New Zealand, 42% of all of our food is wasted, compared to a place like Latin America, where 15% of our food is wasted. And if we look at North America, 61% of the food that we waste is consumption waste. So that means we produce it, we handle it, we process it, we get it to market, and then we consumers buy it and we waste most of that food, right? So from the consumer side, this is a place where we can make some changes, right? Just buy what you need, eat what you buy. When you go to Reason or Dining Hall, fill up your plate with things you're going to eat and try to minimize what you're putting in the trash. Also think about what you eat. So this is another graphic that I show in my intro to sustainability class. This shows the number of kilograms of grain needed to produce 1 kilogram of bread. So for bread, it's 1-to-1, or 1 kilogram of live weight gain. So like if you eat chicken, if you eat a kilogram of chicken, it took 2 kilograms of grain to feed that chicken to achieve that kilogram of chicken that you're eating. So 2 kilograms of grain for 1 kilogram of chicken. As we go higher up on the food chain, it's 3 kilograms for 1 kilogram of pork, or 8 kilograms for 1 kilogram of beef. This is just the food, right? It's not counting the water resources either, which is also much higher for beef as a consumption. So, eat lower on the food chain, incorporate more vegetation into your diet and less animal-based protein, because it's, the grain produced and the animals themselves are also significant sources of greenhouse gases. So again, just some small changes: waste less food, buy less, eat what you buy, don't throw out so much food, and eat lower on the food chain. And these are changes that I expect that we will all need to be making in the future. So think about doing them now, so that when we get to the point where we quote unquote have to do it, you'll already be there, right? We can also think about how we move. So Shippensburg is in the process of putting together a climate action plan. And as part of that, we did a survey of faculty, staff, and students in terms of how they come to campus. And these are our average commuting miles for students, faculty, and staff. Faculty, you can see, have an average commute of 16 miles. I'm looking at you, Dr. Hawkins. Staff have an average commute of 10.25 miles, and students have an average commute of 8.25 miles. So that's about how far, for folks who drive to campus, that's kind of the distances that they're driving. And as much as I, kind of pick on the faculty for having a longer commute, there's more of you than there are of us. So you guys actually, in terms of our emissions, make up about a third of our campus emissions from commuting. And as we dug into this data, I was even more shocked to learn that of the students who drive, 22% of you live within 1 mile of campus. About 40% live within 2 miles of campus. And for faculty and staff, about 15% of us also live within 2 miles of campus. And these are people who are driving already. So we're driving to go 2 miles or less. In the US, 40% of all urban journeys are 2 miles and under, but 90% of those trips are made by car. So in my world, 2 miles is not worth getting into a car for. It is worth getting on a bike, right? This is a picture from Copenhagen, which is arguably one of the most bicyclingist cities in the world. About 60% of the residents of Copenhagen and Denmark ride their bike to work. This is in the winter, it's snowing, and they're smiling about it, right? So we can ride our bikes, we can walk, even if it's raining or snowing or sunny or windy. It will help us connect with nature. It will help us connect with other people. And in the US, we are making, and I know biking in the US is hard. I've biked in many cities across the United States. And sometimes you take your life in your own hand. Sometimes you get harassed. But I'm an underdog. So be an underdog, get on your bike, walk. Sometimes you're going to get coal rolled on you by some Yahoo in a big truck. But you can still, join the movement, because that guy in the big truck is paying way more for gas than you are when you're on your bike. So I encourage you to take these small steps, because again, we are going to be needing to make these small sacrifices to get to the future that we want to have. So that's my plug. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. I think I can mute this now, because our next presenter, Dr. Misty Knight, will be talking to us about the impacts of climate justice, especially focusing on women of color. So thank you. You want to come up for a bit? Okay. I can share the screen, I guess, so that people still know what it is.
I have a tendency to keep talking, so I did set my stopwatch already, just to, and I already told Dr. Haase to, cut me off if I just keep talking. So according to the UN Commission on Women, the climate crisis is not a gender neutral event. Women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change, and this amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their livelihoods, their health, and their safety. Women around the world are disproportionately affected by climate change, and moreover, Black and brown women disproportionately impacted. So today I want to share a little bit about why climate change is an issue of gender equity and women's rights. And I will talk briefly about two main issues: food security and general safety and gender-based violence. So climate change has serious ramifications in 4 dimensions of food security, many of which have been discussed already by Dr. Jantz and Dr. Maret. So food availability, food accessibility, food utilization, and then food system stability. According to the United Nations Gateway on Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women, their fact sheet, women farmers currently account for up to 80% of all food production in developing countries, depending on the region. About 2/3 of the female labor force in developing countries and more than 90% in many African countries are engaged in agricultural work. In the context of climate change, traditional food sources become more unpredictable and scarcer. Women face the loss of income as well as harvests, and harvests are often their sole sources of food and income. Related increases in food prices make food more inaccessible to poor people, in particular women and girls, whose health has been found to decline more than male health in times of food shortages. Furthermore, women are often excluded from the decision-making processes on access, use of land, the resources that are critical to their own livelihoods. And so for these reasons, it's important that the rights of rural women are ensured in regard to food security, non-discriminatory access to the resources, and equitable participation in the decision-making processes. In poor communities in most developing countries, women and girls are responsible for collecting the traditional fuels, which is a physically draining task that can take, on average, 2 to 20 hours, sometimes even more per week. And so as a result, women have less time to fulfill domestic responsibilities, earn money, engage in politics or other public activities, learn to read, acquire other skills, or simply rest. Girls are sometimes kept home from school in order to help gather fuel, and this just perpetuates the cycle of disempowerment. Moreover, when environmental degradation forces them to search further away for resources, women and girls are more vulnerable to injuries due to carrying heavy loads for long distances, and they also will face increased risks of sexual harassment and assault. And so this leads me to my second point about safety and gender-based violence. Climate change also has serious implications for the safety of women and girls. Climate change is what's considered a threat multiplier, meaning it escalates social, political, and economic tensions in often fragile settings and conflict-filled settings. And as climate change drives conflict around the world, and based on some of the things that we've already heard so far today, we see how that conflict could continue to emerge. Women and girls face increased vulnerabilities to all forms of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, human trafficking, child marriage, and other forms of violence. When disasters strike, which, as Dr. Maret alluded to, increased numbers of natural disasters and storms, severity of storms, women are less likely to survive and more likely to be injured due to longstanding gender inequalities that have created disparities in information, mobilization, decision-making, and then just accesses to resources and training. In the aftermath of that, women and girls are less able to access relief and assistance, which will further threaten their livelihoods, well-being, and recovery. It creates a vicious cycle of vulnerability to future disasters. Women's and girls' health is also endangered by climate change and disasters because it will limit the access to services and healthcare, as well as increasing risks related to maternal and child health. Research indicates that extreme heat increases will increase the incidence of stillbirth, and climate change is increasing the spread of vector-borne illnesses, Zika virus, malaria, dengue fever, and these are all linked to worse maternal and neonatal outcomes. So again, directly impacting the lives of women and girls. So while women and girls face a disproportionate impact from climate change at the global level, the effects aren't uniform. Looking at climate change through the lens of intersectional feminism, the way that various forms of inequality operate together and exacerbate each other, it's clear that climate change risks are more acute for Indigenous women, those of Afro descent, older women, those in the LGBTQ+ community, women and girls with disabilities, migrant women, and those living in rural, remote, conflict and disaster-prone areas. Demonstrating great capacity as leaders, experts, educators, and innovators, women and women's movements have long been making strides in preserving and protecting resources around them. We see examples even from the 1970s. Women took the lead in grassroots movements in India and the Chipko movement, literally surrounding the trees that corporations were attempting to destroy. Some of the first tree huggers. They also protected water sources from those corporations. Similarly, in the Greenbelt movement on the very first Earth Day in, or it wasn't the first Earth Day, but in Kenya, it's another famous initiative that was started by women. And so women around the world continue to fight against climate change, for making more sustainable choices, improving access to, control over, and conservation of resources. Our voices must continue to be comprehensively integrated into the discussions. They have to be integrated into policy and implementation efforts at every stage for the well-being of future generations.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Very good. Wonderful series of talks, diverse topics, hitting many of the important points. So we do have time for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'm sure one of our panelists can answer it, or if you want to direct it at one of our panelists, that would be great too. Questions, comments? Yes.
So in the form of like large or smaller nations of large cities, mainly in East Asia, looking at like Korea with Seoul, Japan, and their metropolitan areas that will not have any room for solar or very little room for wind power. The feasibility of nuclear fission, I know Korea and US, we've just made our first fusion reaction that produced energy instead of consuming more. So has that been talked about? Removing coal and oil-fired power plants and natural gas power plants and introducing more safer nuclear power plants?
Well, Japan has done that, where the majority of their electricity generation comes from nuclear. And then, of course, the downside of that was illustrated with Fukushima. And so that is one of the push and pulls with nuclear. I think we still have concerns around safety. And as Dr. Maret pointed out, nuclear, any of these sources of energy are not without their downside, because in the US, we have a huge problem with environmental justice and uranium mining on Navajo lands, for example. Do you want to add to that?
Sure, I'm one of the people who think we need nuclear. I think that in spite of its costs, that used properly, it has a lot of benefits. It runs 24 hours a day, for example. I'm not optimistic about fusion. It always seems like it's 20 years in the future, and 20 years from now, it's going to feel like it's 20 years in the future. We have to be careful though. One of the dangers with nuclear, right now is that it takes about 30 years to permit and build a nuclear plant, and we don't have 30 years. So if we're going to use nuclear, we better start now because it's not going to save us. We're going to have to rapidly move to all available technologies.
Go ahead. And then,
So, you were talking about like walkability and like biking stuff, and I know there's a huge issue, at least here, about the fact that our cities aren't really walkable, they aren't designed for that. Do you think that it is realistic to like redevelop current cities, or is it something that we should strictly keep in mind for new structure?
I would argue that we are rapidly retrofitting our cities for alternative transportation, including cycling. The thing with biking, right, is that it can also relate to an equity issue. If you can design or redesign your urban and suburban landscapes for bikes and for pedestrians, you're also designing them for people who have disabilities, for example. We have so long been invested in cars and car-oriented transportation. We have an opportunity right now with the, what's it called? The Inflation Reduction Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bills. We're about to make some huge investments in transportation, and we just need to diversify how those dollars get spent. We shouldn't be spending them on automobile-oriented transportation. We need to be spending them on different types of transportation. And if we went back in time and looked at Copenhagen in the 1960s, they were traffic jammed. I mean, they did it in 20 years. They reoriented their entire transportation infrastructure around bicycling. And so it can be done, it can be done quickly, as long as we make that mental change, both individually and at the kind of policy level, at the decision maker level of how we spend that money. And I think by individuals choosing to ride bikes, it helps to send a signal to the decision makers and the policy makers that the demand is there, that people will ride their bikes if they build the environment for it.
it sort of makes me think about how a lot of these problems are cut across many levels, from the top down, from government agencies and things like that, and the bottom up. So like when you get people involved, it can move the top to act more quickly and do the right thing. So really good point. Dr. Cornell.
So we just, a group of 14 students and I, over spring break, went to the Bahamas, and Raymond was in that class, and I sort of talked about, on your map, right, show Bahamas, on the map, but there's 400,000 Bahamians that they're already refugees in the sense that they escaped slavery, and they were refugees in the first place. Now the Bahamian economy is solely based on sort of tourism and recreation, and the out islands where we spent was sort of a link between Dr. Maret and Dr. Knight's presentation. There, the out islands women are at home with kids. Men are off island. They're working in the key industries of the Bahamas, tourism, recreation. And so literally that island nation of 400,000 people, they've got 10 to 15 years before they envision that their economy collapses. And so I asked all of you sort of perspective. I mean, this is a question that I asked Raymond and his fellow students. How are we prepared? We're the biggest next door neighbor, right? How are we preparing for these real,
issues. How do
Send them
you,
up to Cape Cod.
but you're asking a question you already know the answer to. We are not preparing. It's that blunt. We are not preparing.
Yeah, I mean, these are some of the issue of climate refugees is a real one. And in our current political climate here in the US, but also in many other countries, we are not opening our doors to climate refugees. And I would agree with what Dr. Maret said, is that this is a moral issue for us, because we in the US have created the conditions that are now being felt by many of the poorer countries. But if it were to happen today, if today 400,000 Bahamians said we need to come because we've just lost our island, I would be fearful for how the United States would treat those people.
Agreed. I was thinking that as you were presenting, and the map of who's the biggest contributor and who's safe. And I think the fact that we don't have any accountability, there really is no one to say, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that. And so there really is no incentive, other than on a moral level. And that is hard to come by sometimes with politicians, so.
It is ironic, we are a nation of immigrants. And yet we are presently, as a country, so unwilling to take immigrants.
And that also has economic consequences too, because, you might have heard that, well, the unemployment rate is pretty low and companies can't find workers. Well, that's part of the reason. A lot of people would love to come to this country to work, but yet we just have so many barriers for them to enter. Other questions?
Going back pretty far in history, looking back at the Monroe Doctrine, the original outline for U.S. to plan to protect North and South America was for smaller nations that couldn't protect themselves, incorporating them into the United States as a territory to where we can provide them the resources, benefits, and protection, while also giving them our experience and knowledge beforehand. Has that been considered by any form of government? I know I've never seen anything on the news about it, and it's such an old policy, but it's still something we feel very relevant, especially with the pressure of China trying to move in their foreign corporations where they don't have environmental protection regulations, and they'll just dredge through a coral reef wherever they feel like. We're seeing it now in Australia. So I don't know if that's been considered.
I think they have no reason to trust us. Our history in Latin America is awful. And
Take Puerto Rico.
That's what I was thinking.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, if you would go ahead and respond to Raymond, then go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, I have a question. I have, as academics do, I have a comment and a question. But my question to you, and I'll give you a second to think about it here, and then I'll add my comment while you think, is for the three of you to reflect on, especially from a justice perspective, the difference between individual responsibility and collective action and collective responsibility. And where you think we should, and obviously we should do everything, right? But kind of reflect on those differences. And I want to return to something that you offered, Claire, in your talk, and it's particularly about the diet choices. I have two comments. So one, first of all, I agree with you that we should eat lower on the food chain, right? Because I think it's a more realistic diet for humans as we evolve, and there's lots of reasons. But that grain to grain comparison assumes that those animals are fed grain, which in most of the world, those animals are not fed grain. In fact, globally, cattle, only about 13% of the diet of cattle globally is actually human grain. And if you look at cattle comparing human edible protein to human edible in to human edible protein out, it's actually positive, right? So, and so the issue is more the system that's producing it, right?
Yeah.
So yes, eat less meat, but everyone in this room eating fewer hamburgers is not going to change the way that Cargill runs the international trade of commodities and the vertically integrated production of beef. Secondly, so to that end, eat less meat, but also, so eat lower on the food chain, but also support alternative economies. There's an individual action perhaps, but maybe we can think about collective action. Secondly, in most of the world, livestock, particularly ruminants like cattle, are incredibly important to marginal livelihoods, to food security, and to nutritional diversity and healthy diets for many people in the global south. And so I just want to offer that nuance to think about individual action versus collective responsibility, because the narrative that everyone should be vegan or vegetarian actually it actually can create a lot of problems for a lot of people in much of the world.
Yeah, I totally agree, Russ, Dr. Hedberg, and I think that, yeah. I mean, I think that from the Western North American US perspective, we eat way too much meat. Our whole kind of meat industrial, our food industrial complex, right? Our method of producing food in general is a disaster for the climate. I certainly wouldn't look to somebody in Kenya, for example, and say, you know, you should really be a vegetarian because your cows fart too much. You know what I mean? Like, I think that Dr. Hedberg makes some really important points about what works where. And in the US, certainly our food production system is a huge source of carbon. It's arguably producing a lot of health issues in our population. And so, as I said in my talk, it's not just individual action, right? Like we need to see kind of a reorganization of how we produce food and you know, big changes in other sectors of our economy to really have a change, to really lower carbon emissions. I would still argue that as those changes are made, if we send signals as consumers that we don't want to eat that type of meat, that helps to move the process forward.
You know, a few years back, the Lancet, which is a very well-respected scientific journal, published a global diet, a diet for the planet, balancing all these nutritional needs and all these environmental needs. And they published, you know, their recommendations, and it included beef. But I think it's interesting to look at how much it included: 1/4 pound per person per week. For malnourished people, that's more than they're getting now, much more. That's valuable protein. For the average American, that's a huge cut. But I think it's interesting to think about. If you're really interested in leading a planet healthy diet, aim for 1/4 pound a week. That means you can have a hamburger every week. That means you can have a 1/2 pound steak every 2 weeks. That means if you really want a monster 1 pound steak, limit it to once a month. But the rest of your diet should be other things. Allow that be for the people who need it in terms of the total carbon footprint of the planet.
I think there's an important balance between the individual movement and then the top-down movement. And yes, we need to have policies put into place. We need to have our leaders make some decisions that are going to be feasible and help us continue in our future. But this is where I get to also put the hat of human communication studies on, as well as women's and gender studies. It's the idea that we need to be able to understand, think critically, and then find our voice and speak out. We need to be telling people about this, not just this, you know, ooh, scary, climate change, we're all going to die kind of thing, which is what I really appreciated about what Dr. Maret started with. It, you know, okay, it's not the worst, it's not the best, we're kind of falling in the middle here. But it's not about scaring people, but how do we articulate that? How do we convince people? How do we reach the hearts and minds of people? And, you know, when I think about, you know, it all comes back to the Lorax, which I'm going to terribly misparaphrase, but, you know, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to change. It's not. And that's it. I mean, that's the heart of it.
You quoted it perfectly, by the way. Perfect.
Any other questions? Great discussion, by the way. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
So going forward, it feels like we're just gonna have more global conflicts to address, especially right now, you know, basically the entire Western world is throwing billions of dollars at Ukraine right now. And I feel like moving forward with water resources and everything across the world, that's gonna become an issue. So I don't really expect anyone to have an answer for this, but how do we factor that into continuing to move forward and addressing climate change?
I don't know that I have an answer, but this comes up a lot when, especially when we deal with political differences, right? Like, you know, we sort of talked about that earlier. I think the first step is to keep talking. I mean, I think a lot of times, and now we're seeing it so much nationally and also internationally, is that the lines of communication are starting to break, right? And that's problematic. But I think if we can at least keep the dialogue going, and find those shared interests, you know, people of different political persuasions often have very shared interests when it comes to things like clean air and clean water. They can agree that they want those things. And so maybe that gives the opportunity for them to work together on those. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
I would also add, I don't think this solves the Ukraine, you know, the war issue, but I think we are reaching a real critical point where people are realizing that the last 75 years has been chasing a myth that the more stuff you own, the happier you are. And here we are, you know, one of the richest countries in the world, a horrible distribution of wealth. People feel like I'm tired of working for the 1%. We're finding increased levels of you know, psychological issues, stress, depression, and so on. The present system is not working for most people. And I would almost argue you have to hit a low before you can move beyond it. And I think we're hitting that low. Our economy is not serving people, it's serving the few. We're destroying, you know, a lot of valuable environmental resources. We're driving other species extinct. And I want to see us reach that point where, you know, I'm madder than hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. We have to transform our economy. And I'm hopeful that enough people are seeing the damage that our carbon economy has caused and realizing we can't continue this with the renewable economy. We can't have a bunch of people driving electric F-150s and Hummers and living in mansions. We have to start to value people and not things. So I'm optimistic that we actually can transform things.
Excellent. Any other questions? Yes.
So Dr. Maret, you just made this point again with the path where we value the people and not things, and that ties into Dr. Jantz, where you said that if we get away from this consumeristic economy, like what is the first step in like creating that into a part of today's society? Because we are so fixated on getting the latest iPhone, the latest computer, and our society is built on things having to be constantly rebought, or like your washing machine goes up, instead of fixing it, you buy a new one. Everyone needs new. So how do we create this value of people?
I would argue the first step is to take a walk in the woods. You know, let's reconnect to nature. Let's reconnect to family. Let's realize that we've been worked to death. You know, wouldn't it be nice to have a 3 or 4 day work week? We should. There's no reason that we can't. Let's break out of that mold. Let's not demand a new iPhone. But, you know, we get into Dr. Hedberg's question about top down versus bottom up. some of these economic problems have to be solved from the top down, but it's only gonna happen when the bottom gets angry enough that they demand it. So vote, organize, find like-minded people. Take a walk in the woods.
I think some of the small things going on the panel, but we had, you got to see Student Sustainability Showcase, we had Fashion Archive showing how not to throw your jeans away, and we'll be posting more pictures of what they're doing today, of showing, like, don't be disposable. Green Lake was there talking about ways that you can be involved. We were there as the Center for Land Use and finding the practical ways that we cannot be a disposable society. So to that point, I think there are things that as students, you can look at what's going on and different ways that even on campus you can learn. They were teaching even about fibers and how to buy, sustainable clothing. So I think there's a movement underfoot.
Yeah.
I think it's the psychology of people, the communication, and like taking all of these specialties and getting the voice of the students out there. And I'm optimistic because it's the next generation taking it more seriously than I think my generation did. So sorry to jump
No,
in.
that's-
but
no,
I
no,
had
no,
to
no.
get that in there because I just saw so much going on in the Cub over the last couple of hours. So.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope too that, like Dr. Maret said, and you illustrated as well, that it hopefully is a generational thing and that people are starting to question, the traditional model, I guess, as it were. So, yeah.
Good job. Yeah.
Yeah, can I add on to, I want to add on to this conversation, especially for students. I think that the most important thing you can do as a college student right now is use the time here to develop your creative capacity. Because so much of what we see not happening is not believing that the world can be different. And I always tell my students, when you find yourself saying, well, this will never happen, but cut off that first part. Because if you want the world to look a certain way, especially in your life or your community, then you are in a position of so much opportunity to actually make that happen. The world doesn't have to be the way it is right now. It works the way that it does right now because along the way, people make little decisions and now it works this way, right? But that's all stuff that we made up. And we can make up new stuff and it'll take a while to get to that new stuff. But if you develop your creative capacity and say, wouldn't it be great if I'm going to try to make that happen? Maybe just in your life, maybe just in the life of you and your neighbors or your family or what have you, but that spreads, right? And like Claire said, I think the best reason to change your diet is because as changes come along, you're already there and it's spreading, right? So develop your creative capacity and just say, this world can be different. Okay, and maybe that means just like, don't buy the new iPhone next time, right? That's a small start, but just believe that doing that little thing can lead to a bigger change, right? Believe that. I think that's really important, especially in college, right? You're here to get credentials and you will, and you're gonna get a job and you're gonna do well, but you're also here to open your mind, right? Because a different world is possible.
And what's kind of cool is we need everybody.
Yeah.
We need the scientists to come up with the technologies. We need the economists to envision a new economy. We need the entrepreneurs to invest in things that don't just provide money, but provide value. We need the social scientists to figure things out in terms of how we work together. We need the artists and the writers and the poets to show us the way. We need everybody here. I don't care what your major is. There's a place for you.
And if you feel like, because you're so overwhelmed and you just can't think creatively, as Dr. Maret said, take a walk in the woods or along the rail trail or down by the athletic complex. The psychologists have actually studied this and being in nature slows people down, makes them feel better, but it also does enhance their thinking and their creative thinking. So I'll leave you with that since I think we are right at 1 o'clock. So thank you to the panelists for an excellent discussion and the audience for their contribution. So thanks again and have a wonderful day.
I wanted to ask.